Hello, welcome to week 3 of bioethics. So for this week, I just want to focus on a single chapter of Rebecca Skloot's book, plus we're going to go into some basic ideas about argument and logic that I teach in every course that is important for framing any issue that we discuss philosophically. All right, so the single chapter of the book that I want to focus on is chapter 6. It's really short, but it packs a lot in there. So chapter 6 is like a play in 3 acts in that it keeps setting up expectations for the audience and then giving them a twist, right? So the first act is Skloot's encounter with Roland Petillo. So Roland Petillo was a student of George Guy, the person who originally cultured the Gila cell line along with his wife Margaret. He was one of George Guy's only African-American students. So Petillo is now a professor at Morehouse. He's a very famous scientist. He researched trophoblast stem cells, and he's also acting as an informal representative of the Lax family. And this is the first of several times that Skloot has to essentially win the trust of someone who is acting like a gatekeeper. Right? So to understand why she has to win someone's trust, we have to think about why there are gatekeepers here and why they might be suspicious of Rebecca Skloot. And this passage right here just lays it on the line. Eventually he said, "Correct me if I'm wrong, but you are white. Is it that obvious?" "Yes. What do you know about African Americans and science?" So to understand why there are gatekeepers here, we have to flat out understand, we need to be thinking explicitly about race, and we need to be thinking specifically about the relationship between African Americans and medicine. Basically, Skloot proves herself by knowing her history. And history is important. As William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." So Skloot specifically cites 2 famous incidents in the history of the relationship between African Americans and medicine: the Tuskegee syphilis studies and the Mississippi appendectomies. We're going to be going into detail about both of those, particularly the Tuskegee syphilis study. Right now, I want to fill in a whole background for what it is that Skloot is demonstrating knowledge of when she cites these incidents, right? So to really understand the history of race and medicine in America, we've got to go back to the slave era, right? So in the slave era, there were a lot of doctors whose primary goal was to justify slavery by demonstrating biological differences between blacks and whites. So here are a couple examples. One is Thomas Hamilton, who experimented on this guy, John Brown, who's in the upper left-hand corner. John Brown had his skin cut and blistered in an effort by Thomas Hamilton to prove that blacks had thicker skin than whites. And this would then in turn justify the way they are treated under slavery. The belief that blacks have thicker skin than whites, by the way, persists to this day, even amongst medical professionals. A really big figure here in the history of medicine in the slave era is this guy Samuel Cartwright. Cartwright invented a device called the spirometer on the left, and he was trying to prove that blacks had a weaker lung capacity. One of the odder things about medicine in this era is anything that you could prove would be used to justify slavery. So in this case, actually, they justified slavery by saying blacks had weaker lung capacity on the grounds that that meant that they needed more exercise. It was a bizarre, twisted pretzel of a piece of reasoning. Oddly, the device that came out of this, the spirometer, is still used to this day, and because measuring lung capacity is important, and the device can do that. Although sometimes it still has a race correction built in, which is nuts. Cartwright was also a critic of the germ theory of disease. You may not have heard of the germ theory of disease because it's now just treated as common sense. It's the idea that some diseases are caused by germs, like viruses and bacteria. So Cartwright was on the wrong side of history for that one, too. And then finally, he had this really bizarre claim. He had to argue that slaves must have a mental disorder that would make them run away from their masters, because otherwise it would be just obvious that they're treated, that they should stay where they are. So what we see here is a lot of really bad science used to advance racism. The other important background feature in understanding this is the eugenics movement. So eugenics, the term, literally just refers to the practice of improving the human gene pool. The idea is that you can breed human beings the same way you breed cats or dogs or horses. And until World War II, it was common for people of all political stripes to believe that the human gene pool should be improved by selective breeding. Liberals believed this. Conservatives believed this. Everyone just took this for granted. And by the way, there are all sorts of simple biological reasons why you can't breed humans the way you can breed cats or dogs. And one of the things you have to recognize is that susceptibility to selective breeding is not evenly distributed, right? I mean, we could domesticate horses, but we could never domesticate zebras. That's because different animals work differently. Humans, no way that you could ever breed humans for specific traits, or and in particular, you'll never be able to breed them for the kinds of traits that people are interested in, like intelligence, because often those traits are badly defined nonsense all on their own. So in any case, this is a bit of early eugenics propaganda, a logo from the Second International Eugenics Conference of 1921, envisioning eugenics as a tree that improves human evolution. One of the important things about eugenics, though, was that for all of this talk of science and human improvement, it was primarily based on a sense of fear and disgust at people who are different. So this is a early exhibit at a eugenics, probably just an ordinary state fair, because they used to have eugenics exhibits at state fairs, right next to the exhibits of prize cows and that sort of thing. But on the left-hand corner, you can see it says, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And that was really the fundamental idea. The concern was that there were people who were weak and unworthy, and they needed to be purged from the gene pool. And so all of this was a focus of racism and xenophobia. One of the curious things is that this is a worldwide movement, but no matter where in the world it cropped up, people there were convinced that someone else was coming from somewhere else. Immigrants from other places were bringing down their personal gene pool. So the emotional drive of it was based on fear and disgust at the idea of human difference. And everything else was a sort of scientific window dressing for that. So it's in the context of the eugenics movement and slave medicine that we have to see Tuskegee as arising. And so we're going to talk more about Tuskegee in the final video for this week. I just want to set some of the scene for this. So you've probably heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, or studies, I should say. And if you haven't, you're going to hear about them now, and you're going to hear about a lot because it's really important. Basically, between 1932 and 1972, doctors claimed that they were treating black patients for syphilis when really they were simply watching the patients die to make records of how long it took them to die. So, in the 1800s, syphilis was treated with mercury, and this was a useless treatment. In fact, it was probably worse than useless. It was probably actually harmful. And during this time, there were studies on the utility of different treatments for syphilis. And sometimes they would involve not treating syphilis at all. And this was reasonable because of something called clinical equipoise. We'll get to this in the third video for this week, but I just want to point out right now that this is a morally necessary aspect of any human clinical experiment. You have to feel like you would be equally well off if you were either in the control group or the experimental group. So no one in the experiment has an advantage. And this was still something that was true when there were no available treatments for syphilis. So let's go back to the timeline. So there's an Oslo study that actually does involve withholding treatment from patients. But that was in right around the turn of the 20th century. In 1910, there was a treatment that was discovered called the 606 treatment. And it was not great, but it wasn't useless either. And so immediately the Oslo study ends because treatment 606 is now available. And it's considered immoral to not give decent treatment to people who are enrolled in a scientific study. In 1929, public health officials in America suggest that mass treatment for syphilis in rural African Americans would work. So just using this existing therapy, treatment 606, would reduce the rate of syphilis among African Americans in the rural South. And it is in this context that the Tuskegee syphilis study itself begins. And in this study, black men are told that they have bad blood and are receiving treatment for this. Bad blood was a common term in African American culture at the time for any number of vague, ill-defined diseases. So it wasn't a real medical diagnosis, and the patients were not receiving real medical treatment, even though treatment 606 existed and it was better than nothing. But in 1943, let's get this straight, the penicillin is introduced as a treatment for syphilis. At this point, the disease is completely curable, 100%. And the patients in the Tuskegee syphilis study are still denied this treatment for another 30 years. Okay, we'll talk more about the Tuskegee syphilis study later in this week. The point I just want to make here is that Skloot demonstrates her worthiness of being let into the Lax family. It let into their confidence by showing her knowledge of this history. The next two acts of chapter 6 are about Deborah and Rebecca. So Patillo sets up all sorts of expectations for Rebecca's meeting with Deborah Lax. And the exercise I had you do was about understanding those. And immediately the first phone call just trashes all those expectations. Deborah Lax is excited to be to talk about her family, and she's full of bubbly statements and sort of odd references to things that will turn out to be real. Like I think Deborah refers to it as the hospital for crazy Negroes, and this was in fact the Maryland Hospital for the Negro Insane, which is going to play a big role in this story. So this sets up more expectations, but the next phone call breaks those down. Deborah has been told by her male relatives that she should not talk to Rebecca, and so her voice is depressed and actually slurred even. And she says the thing you have to do is convince the men. So this third act sets up the next stage, where now Rebecca has to get past the men in the family who are also acting as gatekeepers. And again, she has to do this by proving that she is trustworthy. And everyone in the family has every reason not to trust someone like Rebecca Skloot. All right, so that's chapter 6. The next thing you want to do is read a short excerpt from a critical thinking textbook that I helped put together, so that we can understand a bit about argument. And then we're going to have another reading on the Tuskegee syphilis study.